The Glen Saturday event, we view this here at the Buffalo Bill Historical Center as our first public program celebrating the Scottish experience here in the American West. We have had programs before looking at Buffalo Bill's Wild West in Scotland, but this is the first time we're really looking at the Scottish experience here in the American West. Our goal here at the Buffalo Historical Center through this programming is to establish ourselves as the primary center for study and interpretation of the Scottish experience in the American West. We are partnering with the Bighorn Basin Scottish Society, the University of Strathclyde at Glasgow, Scotland, and the National Trust for Scotland Foundation, USA. So many of the representatives from these groups are sitting in the audience today, so welcome. Our first speaker is John Young. John Young is a senior lecturer at the Department of Modern Languages at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. His interests include early modern Scotland, the pre-1707 Scottish Parliament, early modern Scotland, and Ulster, and the Scottish Covenanters, the British Civil Wars for the Three Kingdoms. You have a lot of interest, John. His topic for today is the Scots and Scots-Irish in the early modern transatlantic world. Please join me in welcoming John Young.
Thanks, Jeremy, for the introduction. I should say I don't work in modern languages. I work in the history department at Strathclyde University. Really, to cut to the chase in terms of the profile that Jeremy gave about me, I really specialise in early modern Scottish history, mostly 17th century Scotland, when Scotland was an independent country, Scotland's religious history, Scotland's political institutions, and increasingly looking at the relationship between Scotland and Ulster and how that goes into America. Now, I am conscious that I've got quite a fast Scottish accent, so I'm going to try and slow it down, try and slow it down so you can understand okay.
Can you use the mic, Mark?
Okay, sorry, I thought I had this on too. Of course, sorry about that. Yeah, so specialised in 17th century Scottish history. And one of the things that I'm going to try to do today is to look at a kind of broader perspective. So when we think about the Scots in the American West, the Scottish experience in the American West, we shouldn't really look at that in isolation, that it's part of a bigger picture and part of trends that were taking place centuries before within Scottish society. The images that you see revolving around me on the screen there are genuine 17th century prints. Several of them are German, and they represent Scottish soldiers fighting in a European war known as the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648, where thousands of Scots fought in that conflict. So there we have the aspect of Scots as soldiers in 17th century Europe, maybe linking that to Scots as soldiers in America in terms of warfare. The portrait that is on one of the images is of Alexander Leslie, a famous Scottish general who served in the Swedish Army and thereafter was a famous Scottish general in Scotland in the 1640s. So these are some visual things to try and hold your attention as I mumble on. Okay, so if we're thinking about the Scottish experience, a wider Scottish experience, and how it might relate to Scots in the American West, very important thing that was apparent in Scottish society for centuries, from the medieval period onward, is that the Scots were a mobile people. They went to lots of different countries, and professional historians in Scotland have defined that as a culture of mobility, that Scottish people had a culture of mobility and that Scottish society exhibited a culture of mobility. So obviously thousands of Scots have come to America, Canada, etc. during the modern age, but in earlier centuries Scots went to lots of other places beforehand. So is that part of the Scottish character? A Scottish tradition of migration that makes people move. So when we look at the American West, that fits into a culture of mobility. A second related aspect, I think that's particularly relevant to what you're doing here in America, is the notion of the frontier, or the Scots as frontiersmen, the Scots as frontiers people in different societies. And that is something that we also see in earlier centuries. Scots as frontiersmen, particularly in different parts of Europe. So collectively, these are certain things I want to emphasise today in the presentation, and maybe try and bring this all together at the end. So we're going to kind of look at some examples of where Scots went, where they migrated to, what they actually did, and how significant their presence was in different parts of the world. So we have Scots as soldiers, Scots as entrepreneurs, Scots as business people, Scots as people who make money, etc. in different countries. So one of the big areas of Scots as a mobile people we can trace back to the medieval period is the link with France. So many Scots went to France during the medieval period. They were important in French universities, and it's been estimated that up to 10,000 Scots fought in the French armies of Joan of Arc against English rule in the medieval period. So France is one example of medieval history where many Scots went, where they settled, and where they had an influence. By the time we get to the mid to late 16th century, what is happening within Scottish society is Scotland is basically spewing out its people. It has too many people. It has a population overload. Scotland in particular has too many young men, so they have to leave the country to make a living. So one of the economic activities that they successfully participated in was that of soldiering, of being soldiers. So from the late 16th century onwards, there is a massive and significant movement of Scottish people to different countries. Now they go to lots of places, but the three main areas they go to are firstly Poland, secondly Scandinavia, in particular Denmark, Norway and Sweden, and thirdly they go to Ulster in the north of Ireland. And that does have a longer term significance because by the early 18th century, Scottish settlers in Ulster are one of the big migrations to colonial North America as the Scots-Irish, or the Scots-Irish. So there's a link, there's a transatlantic link here between Scotland, Ulster and colonial North America by the time of the 18th century. So if we take Poland as a destination, first of all, we can track Scots as being citizens of Krakow and Warsaw in the 16th century. Main period of migration from Scotland to Poland was 1570 to 1650. The first 50 years of the 17th century, it's estimated up to 40,000 Scots went to Poland. They've been traced to 420 locations in different parts of Poland. We have contemporary accounts. Famous Scottish traveller William Lithgow was in Poland in 1616, and he described Poland as the mother and nurse for the youth and younglings of Scotland, particularly young men leaving Scotland to go to Poland. Now, in terms of Poland, it appears that the Scots integrated very quickly and assimilated very quickly. And that is one of the trends that appears to be the case where Scots settle. They appear to assimilate and integrate very quickly in different societies. Many of them, in terms of their activities, were tradesmen or peddlers travelling around the country of Poland selling goods. but many of them were soldiers. So Scots in 17th century Poland, in late 16th century Poland, had quite a formidable reputation as soldiers. This is something that they were regarded as being quite successful at. And indeed, we have the contemporary account of a Polish soldier, a captain, during this period, describing Scots as foot soldiers, and said that he was better off with 2,000 Scots than 6,000 Poles. So that's not the Scots that are saying this. This is what the Poles were saying in the 17th century. So Poland has a very important Polish link there. I was at a conference in France in 2006, and there was a Polish academic there who was the role of Scots in Polish society, and how the Scots were described as the mountain people for some reason, in terms of Polish humour and Polish popular culture. To be kind of more serious then, the next main area that we can identify as being really important is Scandinavia, and that is Denmark, Norway and Sweden. And this was one of the big areas where Scottish people went to. And we really have to look at this in the context of warfare in Europe, of Northern European warfare. So Scotland was a source of troops, of recruiting soldiers for participation in Scandinavian warfare, and also a major war that lasted from 1618 to 1648, the 30 Years' War, which was the early modern equivalent of the First World War that devastated large parts of Germany, northern Germany in particular. So we have evidence of the Danes recruiting 2,000 troops in the 1560s, the Swedes recruiting 3,000 troops in the 1570s, Scottish mercenaries routed the port of Tallinn in Estonia because they weren't getting paid properly, so they went on the rampage in order to get their military pay. We have Scots fighting in the Danish-Swedish War, 1611 to 13, and it's been estimated over a 7-year period, 1625 to 32, that about 25,000 Scots fought in either the Swedish or the Danish armies, and that's just over a 7-year period. So that's quite a significant proportion. In terms of the 30 Years' War, this major European war, one of the main powers involved in the war was Sweden. And Sweden had the best army in Europe at that point. It was Sweden, it was the Swedes who served northern German Protestantism from being overrun. So the Swedes had a very highly regarded army, and this is where the Scots served in particular. So it's been estimated about 60,000 Scots served in the 30 Years' War, and most of them served in the Swedish Army. So what I'm actually saying here, there's a very close relationship between Scotland and Sweden as a destination point. So many Scots went to Sweden. One of them's on the screen, Alexander Leslie. Alexander Leslie was without doubt one of the most significant military commanders in early modern Europe. He enjoyed the patronage of the Swedish Queen, Queen Christina, the Swedish Chancellor, Axel Oxenstierna, and he rose to be a very successful military commander in the Swedish Army. So he had a top military position in the Swedish Army. Later on he returned to Scotland and was very important for the Covenanting Armed Forces. That's the army of a political movement in Scotland in the 1640s that fought against Charles I in a Scottish context. Leslie, as a devout Calvinist and a devout Presbyterian, we have correspondence of him actually wanting to take a Scottish army and march it to the gates of Rome, because what was taking place in Europe, this is a religious war, 1618 to 48. So Sweden was very important, and in terms of wider Scandinavian history, in terms of Norwegian history, the history of Norway, the 17th century is called the Skøyetide, which is the Scottish period. So that would suggest, that's what the Norwegians say, it's not what Scots are saying. So they regard as that's been quite significant. And the timber trade in Norway is known as the Skutehandelen, which is the Scottish trade. So that's evidence from Norway, Denmark, Norway, Scandinavia, from their perspective of Scottish significance. Now, one of the things that we see in Scandinavia, which I think is quite interesting, is the establishment of successful Scottish communities, commercial networks and family dynasties. So in these areas, the Scots seem to assimilate quickly, integrate quickly, become successful quickly, and make money quickly. So places like Bergen in Denmark, Norway, and Gothenburg in Sweden, and Stockholm all had a successful Scottish business communities and Scottish merchants. In terms of local government, like town councils, etc. In terms of individual people, we can give you some examples. Axel Mowat was the son of a Scottish admiral. He was a major timber trader in terms of trading back to Scotland, and he was reputed to be one of the richest men in Denmark, Norway by the 1640s. In Gothenburg, John Spalding was the president of Gothenburg Council of Commerce in the 1640s. And very interestingly, an individual called John Maclean from the island of Mull off the Scottish mainland was reckoned to be the richest man in Sweden. He was also a Gothenburg town councillor, a member of the Swedish Parliament. So this is a man who makes money very quickly, very successfully, and he establishes a family dynasty, the Macleans of Gothenburg. And Maclean's sons dominated the commercial and political life of Gothenburg in the later 17th century. What we also see in a Scandinavian context and a Northern European context is Scots as frontiersmen. And this is something that's only been discovered quite recently by other historians. So an important individual here was John Cunningham, who was from Fife in Scotland. And John Cunningham was the governor of Finnmark. And Finnmark is in the most northern part of Norway. So he was the governor there between 1619 to 51. He had a monopoly of fishing rights, and he encouraged family, friends and networks to settle there. So there you have the example of a Scottish frontiersman bringing his family, extended community, to settle on a frontier to make it work. We also see that in a Swedish context too. So Scots who had fought for the Swedish crown and who had fought in the Swedish armed forces were often given land grants. And they were given land grants in areas that had been newly conquered. So you had Scots as frontiersmen in the Swedish Empire, particularly in areas that bordered with Russia and onto the Baltic. So if we're thinking of the notion of the Scot as a frontiersman, this doesn't just happen or pop up in the American West. It's been happening centuries before in other countries. And if we think about Scots as soldiers and Scottish military activities, we have Alexander Leslie in Sweden. We also have people who were important in Russia in the 1660s and the 1670s. Also people who are important not only in the army but also in terms of naval and maritime interests. As the centuries progressed, Samuel Gregg in Birkeven in Fife, regarded as the founding father of the Russian Navy. And also, if we're thinking about maritime influence over a longer period of time, of course we have John Paul Jones, born in Kirkcudbright in southwest Scotland, served the American cause in the American War of Independence, and quite rightly is recognised as the father of the United States Navy. So here we have military and maritime things. Now, the remaining time I've got left, I'm going to mention Ulster, because arguably Ulster is slightly more problematic, and it may be slightly more problematic for present-day America in many respects. So during the 16th and the 17th centuries, many Scots migrated to Ulster. That was one of the big destination points. So there were 5 waves of migration between Scotland and Ulster, 16th, 17th century. Most of the people who went to Ulster were from the west of Scotland, or southwest Scotland, people like the Johnsons, Jeremy, etc., one of the migrant groups. And we had the settlement of Scottish communities in County Antrim and County Down. So by 1641, there's about 30,000 Scots in Ulster. The largest migration of Scots to Ulster is in the 1690s, probably about 44,000 went in the 1690s alone. Now this one's particularly important for America, because the people who migrate in the 1690s, they're probably only there for 1 or 2 generations. Then in the early 18th century, they migrate to colonial North America, work their way down to places like the Appalachians, Kentucky, etc., and are known as the Scots-Irish. Now, one of the problems that we have in present-day Northern Ireland about this issue is, do these people stop becoming Scottish? Because one of the arguments that's put forward is that when those people went from Scotland to Ulster, they were changed and they became Scots-Irish, but when they went to America, that's who they were already. So I think there, in terms of a transatlantic context, there is a question mark. Do these people stop becoming Scottish after 1 generation or 2 generations, or do they take their Scottish identity with them to Ireland, and then do they take it to colonial North America? So some examples we have, say, from oral history, from places like Tennessee and Kentucky, even into the 20th century, mothers telling their children to get to their bed, go to sleep, you know, away to your bed, or you don't, bloody clavers will get you. Right? That refers to a man known as John Graham of Claverhouse, who was killed in action at the first Jacobite uprising in 1689, fighting for the Stuarts. But several decades before, he had been one of the agents of the Scottish state who had persecuted Presbyterians in southwest Scotland, and his nickname was Bloody Clavers. So people who grew up in southwest Scotland experienced that tradition. Did that oral tradition go with them to Ireland? Then it goes into the Appalachians. You know, there's an example there from oral history. Now, obviously, in terms of the frontier, this is one of the ways that the Scots-Irish are portrayed, as frontiers people, the people who moved out west originally, who were in conflict with the Native Americans, or people who had an important role in the American War of Independence. So was a frontier mentality for them? Did that happen in Ulster? That's one of the arguments that some historians put forward. So the frontier in the north of Ireland is that these people defending their property, territory, rights, etc. against the native Catholic Irish. Now, as Chris would point out too, that some of this is slightly simplistic, but no, that frontier mentality, was that developed in 17th century Ulster, and did that go into America in terms of the early 18th century migrations? Also, in terms of the concept and the notion of a frontier, this is something that had been underway in Scotland for several centuries. So the Scottish royal family were the Stuarts, Stuart dynasty, founded in 1371. Now the Stuarts, as the Scottish monarchs, wanted to enforce their power over the country and Kingdom of Scotland. So in 1492 they suppressed the Lords of the Isles, which was a rival power structure that linked Scottish and Irish Gaeldom. That frontier had to be taken apart, as per Stuart policy. James VI, King of Scotland, had a frontier policy in attempting to extend Crown influence into the Scottish borders against people like the Johnsons and the Armstrongs, who were criminals and stealing sheep and doing all these types of things. Also the Highlands. So to drive a wedge between Scottish and Irish Gaeldom, that was a policy. He did have a frontier policy, and that's why you have British Protestant settlement in Ulster too in the 17th century. So the Gaels of Scotland and Ireland were regarded as barbarians, so they were to be civilised. So this policy of civilising the Gael and having a law and order issue in the borders, civilising the Gael applied to both Scottish and Irish Highlanders. Now, to finish off, if we project this into a kind of 18th century context, after 1707, Scotland and England merged to become Great Britain. So we have Scottish soldiers and we have Scots as soldiers and colonial governors in places like India. Or also Patrick Gordon, governor of Pennsylvania, 1726 to 1736. We have Scots who fought on both sides in the American War of Independence and the American Civil War. Very interesting thing that strikes me, because I look at the Scotland and Ulster issue, is the Battle of the King's Mountain, 1780, South Carolina, very important for the American Revolution. There was a key role there played by the Scots-Irish of the South Carolina backcountry in that battle. The commander of the British armed troops there was a Scot, Major John Ferguson, and some of the British troops were Highlanders as part of the British Army. So what you see then in South Carolina in 1780 is a kind of bizarre situation of Highland Scots now fighting in a British army, and Scots-Irish Americans who could trace their roots back to places like southwest Scotland. So is it a kind of a wider Scottish thing over several generations that was being fought out in a colonial conflict? That's something for people, I think, over here to think about. So I think to finish off, where does this all fit in to the project here about Scots in the West and the Scottish experience in the American West? Well, I think what I've tried to argue is that Scottish migration to the American West later on needs to be placed within a wider context of the Scottish culture of mobility that had existed for centuries. Scots were a mobile people. One thing that is quite interesting perhaps is landscape and environment. So did the landscape and environment help the Scots as a frontiers people, whether here in America or whether in different parts of Europe centuries ago? Scottish military, the Scottish military tradition, soldiering, if you're thinking about Scots in the American Civil War or Scots in the US Cavalry in the 19th century or whatever, that's a military tradition that just didn't pop up there. That can be traced back centuries too. And I think from a Scottish perspective, that the experience and achievements of those Scots who did migrate and settle here and contributed to the development of the American West in places like Wyoming, Montana, etc. I think that's something that people back in Scotland really should have a greater awareness of, because not that many people know about it that much, I would argue, although there is a very important appreciation of the American West in popular culture, such as the films that you see the posters of here, music, etc. And finally, 2014 will be the second year of homecoming, sponsored by the Scottish Government. So for those of you who do have Scottish ancestry, and even those who don't, it's probably a good time to visit if you're planning a trip to Europe. Not only is it the 700th anniversary of the Battle of Bannockburn, but it's when there's going to be a referendum on Scottish independence from the United Kingdom, so it should be an interesting time to visit and find out a bit more about Scottish history. So thank you very much.